Hello and welcome to a special presentation from the Light Network on America, racism, and the gospel. My name is Robert Hatfield, and I'm happy that you've chosen to tune into this discussion. And I am looking forward to a discussion today. Joining us are three preaching brothers whom I love and respect. And we'll begin, since he's already on the screen, with Zack Martin, who preaches for the Cedar Springs congregation in the Louisville, Kentucky area. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Welcome. We're glad you're here. You've been in Louisville for quite a while now.
I'll be 13 years in December.
Wow, that's great.
So
Not
right
all of
after I
that.
graduated from Freed.
Okay, not all of that at the Cedar Springs congregation, right?
No, this is my fourth congregation. I've been at Cedar Springs for about 3.5 years.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we appreciate you, Zach. And Zach and I were at Freed Hardeman together there for a little while, and so those were fun times. I like to think I've come a little ways since then.
I hope we all have.
Also joining us today is Stephen Ford, who is joining us from Arkansas. And Stephen, you're going to have to remind me of the rest of the details. I'm so sorry, I forgot to check before we started.
Okay.
Welcome,
We're right outside of Little Rock at the Highway Church of Christ in Benton, Arkansas.
That's
Central,
right.
Central Arkansas.
All you needed to do was just remind me, and then I remembered.
There we go.
I've known Stephen now for a little while as well, going back to his time when he was in preaching school in Memphis, I guess, is when we first crossed paths through the connections at East Hill and Pulaski. And so anyway, glad to have you as a part of the discussion today, brother. You've helped me in discussions similar to these in the past, and so I'm grateful that you're willing to come back on today.
Glad to be here, man. Thank you for having me on.
Also with us today is Hiram Kemp, joining us from the South Florida Avenue congregation in Florida.
That's right, Lakeland, Florida.
Lakeland.
I was about to say, I'm glad you remember where I'm from.
I was between Lakeland and Lake City. I knew it started with the lake. And the bad thing is, Hiram is one of our podcasters here on the Light Network, and I still don't remember where he's podcasting from, so that's great.
Way to be appreciated.
I know, right? Perfect. You can catch Hiram and his cohort, Forrest Antimaceris, on God Magnified, seeing the glory of God in every book, that is, book of the Bible. And y'all just had a great first season of that show. People need to go listen if they haven't done so yet. It's great stuff.
They do. We covered James and Jude. It was a great first season, and we're looking forward to coming back for another one.
Yeah. It's an in-depth approach, too, which I really like. And then you have how God is magnified. There, you always include that at the end of each episode. It's really, really good stuff. I look forward to it on Mondays. It's really great. Today we're talking about, as we said, America, racism, and the gospel, and that I think for obvious reasons. Our headlines, at least in America, and no doubt worldwide, are just focusing on the terrible injustice surrounding the murder of George Floyd. And we're just mourning over that. And then in the aftermath of that, everything that has happened since then. And it makes it really more complicated, I think, than it needs to be. I think what I just said about the murder of George Floyd is actually fairly simple in terms of what happened. But I wanted to just have a conversation about this. And I need to tell you guys, and I have already, that I think many of us, myself included, are only beginning to wake up as far as the reality and the presence of racism, and that it's not a thing of our past. It's not something that Dr. King buttoned up for us back during his life, and then of course then in his death. This is something that is very much still a present part of what we're dealing with in America, and we see that in every aspect of it, and even to some degree within the church in America. And, we don't want to pretend like this is just a problem that's limited to America either, and we're going to talk about some of the roots of this as we go through this, but we're speaking from an American context, and so maybe to limit the discussion there doesn't narrow it down a whole lot, but at least helps us to begin to get our brains around some of this. My role in this, with these three guys for this episode, is to ask some questions and to listen. And if you are like I am and you're listening or viewing this on our YouTube channel, then I hope that this can be a good discussion. We're going to talk about these three issues, and we're going to talk about them somewhat in tandem. Specifically, that last word that's in our title, and the gospel, because we want to focus on that and see just how important of an issue this actually is. As we get started, and Hiram, you're still on the screen here on our little Zoom call, so I guess I'll begin with you if that's okay. We wanted to talk first about just what is racism, and would you tell us how you define that? And then after that, guys, please feel free to chime in and add to that if you will.
Okay, yeah, I know sometimes people talk about racism and they'll say there's one race, the human race, which is true. Mm-hmm. But in the context in which we live, people have been defined and categorized by skin color for a long time. And so racism, as far as I can see it, is simply one race of people, whether that be black or white or whatever it might be, basically exalting themselves over another race or viewing themselves as superior, which leads to oppression, mistreatment, and various kinds of injustice. And so it's the idea that just inherent in the pigmentation, just based on how a person looks, that leads to the way we treat people or fail to treat people a certain kind of way. And maybe we'll do this later, but maybe sometimes there needs to be a distinction made between racism and prejudice, though those terms are synonymous. There are people that just look at a person and say, hey, he's black, I don't like him, or hey, he's white, I don't like him. But then prejudice is involved sometimes in that, you know, all racism is prejudice, but all prejudice isn't necessarily racism. There are rich people that just say, I don't like you because you're poor, whether you're black or white or whatever. But racism, strictly speaking, I would deal with it from the standpoint of it relates to how people look and making judgments and treating people based on what I see with my eyes.
Okay. Yeah. And I appreciate that distinction and what you said, that all racism is prejudice, but not all prejudice is racism. And that'll be important as we go through this. I know one of the things we want to emphasize is that the New Testament has a lot to say about really both subjects, about prejudice in general and then racism specifically. And so maybe we'll get into that as we go through it. Stephen or Zach, anything that you want to sort of throw into that to help us a little bit in supplementing what's been said?
Right. I think that's the key. Hiram really nailed it there. It's all about supremacy. And so it's when one group thinks that they are superior to another group based on skin color. I think we often think that, as Hiram says, that prejudice is the worst word, but we all have preferences over one thing or another. And so prejudice doesn't necessarily have to always be a negative connotation. It's just preference. But when it comes to skin color or ethnicity, it's all about supremacy. And we have to be very careful because there's a fine line between racism and nationalism. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with nationalism and being for one's country, but what's the makeup of who you think is in your country or a part of your country. And I think that's really what's divided us, especially here in America, is that when most people think of America, we say that we're united, but they're really picturing a white America in their minds.
Oh, now see that, and that's an interesting point. So much of this has to do with our thinking. And the reason why conversations like this, I believe, are so important is because we're trying to change the way we think, which sounds like a biblical word that I'm fairly familiar with called repentance. But I appreciate you bringing that up. That's a good point. Stephen, you want to weigh in on this before we proceed?
I think that what Hiram and Zach said are probably spot on in terms of one, what racism actually is, but also being extremely careful to delineate between other things, be it prejudice or nationalism or whatever else. That way you isolate the actual problem and you don't say, let's solve racism, and then you actually end up talking about prejudice or you actually end up talking about nationalism. And so if you define your terms very keenly and very specifically, then you can focus on the one thing that's the actual issue without necessarily going around in circles and arguing and being caught up in semantics. So this way we're able to identify what the actual issue is and address it specifically.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. Boy, there's so many tangential things to that point that could come into this discussion. We are merely talking about, as you said, feeling, as you guys said, feeling as though I am supreme to any other human being based on this, as I think the Zach's words were, ethnicity, skin color, things like that. And so that's sort of where we're focused on, and we're talking about that within the context of America. So I guess it could be, right, that nationalism could fuel some folks' racism. Is that right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So for many of us who are white Christian Americans, who are fairly ignorant, just, you know, maybe we're not history buffs, maybe we haven't done all the reading, and I'm saying this now, and I'm ashamed to say it. It's not like history's not my thing. I don't think that's really a good excuse anymore, if it ever was. I mean, we need to know our past and how it shaped our present and how it can shape our future. Did racism ever stop being a problem in America? I mean, it clearly was, you know, decades ago, in previous centuries. Did it ever stop? Stephen, can we start with you on this question and then make our rounds here? Did it ever stop?
No, I don't think it ever has. And I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I don't think it ever will, because people are always going to be here. Sin is going to be here, and the sin of racism will still exist. As long as Satan still can have influence on people's lives, as long as we allow ourselves to be instruments of hatred and wickedness and unrighteousness, you're going to have racism. In addition to having other brands of sin, you'll always have it. Now, one of the things is you have to look at is there are several laws that have changed over the last 30, 40, 50 years. However, hearts and practices have not changed. You may have civil rights laws that said that I can now go into a diner and eat alongside my white brethren. But that doesn't mean that the waiter has to treat me kindly. And that doesn't mean that they have to be fair and balanced in the way that they view me and treat me. And so I think it'll always be with us. And again, I don't want to sound negative, but I think that the reality is that sin, until the Lord returns, is going to be here.
I guess we could probably trace racism specifically, if not prejudice generally, through just about all of Old Testament history almost. I mean, especially, right, when you get with the Egyptians and the Pharaoh who rose up who didn't know Joseph, right? And I guess you could go from there. Zach, would that be a fair way of describing that?
It would be, but I think you can even go back to before that to Joseph's
brothers
in Potiphar's house.
Oh, in Potiphar's house. Yeah.
When Joseph flees and Potiphar comes back, the first thing that Potiphar's wife says is, "This Hebrew that you brought in." So just a distinction, not this slave or this man, but she made Potiphar, think about, it's not just anybody that you brought in, it's this Hebrew that you brought in. So it's always been there. And like Stephen said, it's always been there because it is a sin problem. And it's always going to be there because it is a sin problem. But where I think, and I don't know if we want to go there this quickly, but where the church has failed is that we think that it's done away with, that it's something of the past, that once you become a Christian, I mean, that's done away with. Or I know that we've talked about this some before we started, because we are a Christian nation, it's not here. So that's some of the input I have on that.
I appreciate that. Hiram, what would you add?
Yeah, I would say it's become socially unacceptable. That's pretty much it. Now with the laws that are in place, people would be ashamed to just come out and say things that people said freely 40, 50 years ago. But like Stephen was saying, the laws have changed, but people's hearts haven't. Now, things have improved. There's no doubt about that. There have been some strides, however small or large. We could get into discussion about that, but it's still here. And people that were against the civil rights laws that integrated people, I mean, you just have to stop and think, what do you think they taught their children? What do you think? I mean, some of these things that you see people doing and saying, somebody kept the ball rolling. So yes, it's definitely still here among us. And so I'm with Stephen. It's going to be here as long as people are around, but that doesn't mean it should be tolerated. I think that sometimes as a scapegoat used, well, sin's just here. And we don't say that about any other sin. Like, well, abortion's been going on so long, so, you know, it's just here. There's nothing we can do about it. We do need to cry out against it and step up where we can and do what God would have us to do in that regard.
Yeah. Stephen's really important. He's getting phone calls while we're
right in the middle.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Just wanted to acknowledge that. And I appreciate, Hiram, what you said. That's an important distinction. And I think that leads us as we're getting into the headlines of the day. And that is sort of, I mean, I guess this conversation would have been important at any time. But that leads us into what at least has brought my mind to where I am now. And I'm feeling ashamed because I should have wanted to know more before that. But when we think about what happened with George Floyd, Minneapolis, right, if I'm not mistaken, there was a counterfeit, $20 bill involved?
$20.
Yeah, okay. And somehow, you know, the officer comes in, the video shows us multiple officers that are standing around. I think without us going into that too graphically at this point, although maybe we should, you guys can tell me this, but you see the image of this police officer, and I mean, he's just literally suffocating him, cutting off his airflow. The private autopsy that was ordered by the family, as of the time that we're recording this, has now been released. The results showing that was in fact his cause of death. You know, here's a man within the custody of a police officer who, you know, is supposed to be the good guy, I guess, and we have him doing the wrong thing. We've got bystanders that are just sort of watching this take place, and this has brought a resurgence, at least in the public conversation about the issue of racism and of course all of the other complex issues, everything from, you know, law enforcement and all the things like that. Is there anything that you guys want to comment on about the specific story, or are there any details or anything that you want to add to what I've just mentioned, just for the sake of the record here on this episode?
Yeah, I would say that, so as soon as I saw it and this happened, you know, you see a man on live TV for 8 minutes or whatever, somebody's phone, and he's being basically murdered for all the world to see. And there's a thing in you that maybe we see too much of this. We're becoming desensitized to it. I don't know what the case may be, but there should be something in every person that can just come out and say, that's wrong. That shouldn't have happened. I mean, I know that every cop's not a bad cop, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this occasion right here, and we can have the good cop conversation later. But right now, we're talking about this scenario.
That's right.
And you could pile on top of that. You could talk about the looting and the rioting and all of that. Of course, all of that's wrong. No caveats extended to it. I understand why it's happening, just like I understand a lot of things that I don't agree with or approve of. But if you see that on live TV, you know, and another thing that bothers me about it is the officer knew he was being recorded. I mean, just the boldness to continue to go through with it. And I think what you're seeing with a lot of people being upset is there are countless people, Black people, that have said for years similar things have happened to them and it wasn't recorded. And people said, oh, we don't believe you. And now here's a man being recorded and people are like, another angle, please. Or, oh, we don't believe you, or we haven't had all the facts. And so what might have been before is, well, I'm lacking information, is now turning into I don't want to understand, or I don't want to care. And I don't want to take this too far off, Robert, but even before the incidents in Minneapolis, there was a guy in New York doing the bird watching. And I don't know if you saw that, but there was a woman there, and she had her dog off the leash, and he said some things to her about putting her dog on the leash. And she claimed that she was going to call the police and tell them that he was an African-American man and that he was threatening her. Where does she get that mindset from? Why would she think that would be her first threat? There clearly is a problem in our country with the way these issues are viewed. And so we just got to be honest about that. And I think when you see the video, before you talk about the looting, before you talk about the rioting, deal with the facts that brought that on, or people are just naturally going to question your sincerity and where you're coming from if that's the first thing you say. I'm not saying everybody has to speak out and say the same thing the same way, but if that's all you say, again, it just strikes at the narrative of you don't care. That's how people are going to perceive that. And so if you can see a man be murdered, why can't we just say unanimously, this is a wrong thing, that shouldn't have happened, regardless of what he was arrested for, regardless of whether the the punishment for counterfeit money is not immediate execution on the sidewalk. So regardless of what he was being arrested for, the idea that if you just comply and do what the police officers tell you, all of that doesn't change the facts that he shouldn't have been killed like that day.
Sure. And there's no question that police officers carry weapons with them for a reason. There may be a time when they have to exercise lethal force. Whatever it was, this isn't a part of what they're supposed to be doing. The method here was not within the training. And so there's no excuse for that. You're right, the boldness of what he's going through there, doing it even though he's being filmed. The fact that the others are just standing there, I mean, the camera pans over, right, and shows these other police officers. They're just allowing this to happen for whatever reason. There's so much here that we have to step back and say, okay, you know what? It almost doesn't matter what he did. People are saying, I want more facts. It almost doesn't matter what exactly has gone down here. We know that this is not the way that police officers are supposed to be behaving.
Right, and that's the issue that Hiram brought up is if it was anyone else, you wouldn't ask what are the other factors, or we need more facts. You would just take it as it is, even though it's on video. You would just take the video as is. But in our history, because it is a black man, you don't take the video or someone's word for it. You always have to have more facts.
Yeah.
And that's the history that we deal with on a daily basis, is that no one can take our word, even if it's on video. I mean, it's on video, but why are you asking for more facts or what's behind this?
Yeah.
There's nothing behind it. I mean, the officer murdered George Floyd, and that should be it. And so people are outraged because you are asking beyond what you have. I mean, it's clear cut. There should be no other questions asked.
And ironically, Robert, some of the same things about, we need more facts, we need more proof. The same people can watch a video of people looting and they don't need any facts. They can come to the right conclusion that that's a wrong behavior. To burst into a building and to take property that doesn't belong to you is wrong. And the Bible condemns that, and I can see that as clear as day, and I don't need more commentary on it. Maybe they got reasoning behind it. All of that pushed aside, that's a wrong thing. I don't need to interview them. I don't need another angle. You bust into the Gucci store on Rodeo Drive. That's got nothing to do with injustice. That's wrong. Now, look at a man being crushed under the forearm or weight of somebody's knee and calling out for his mom and all that. And we can get into him saying he couldn't breathe, and yet he could call out for help. But that's a euphemism. I can't breathe can mean a host of things. It means I'm struggling to breathe. I can't breathe clearly. Doesn't mean his airway was totally blocked, because I've seen people try to make that argument. Well, he obviously could breathe if he was still talking. But if we can look at looting and clearly see, this is a wrong deal, and almost condemn everybody out there protesting, even peaceful protesters, we've got to be able to look at the camera and see the same thing without condemning everybody that's peacefully protesting, saying, hey, looting is wrong. And you don't have to condemn every cop to say, hey, this cop and those that stood by idly and watched were wrong. And every time this happens, this is a wrong thing. And Christians just in general need to be against it, black or white. And people shouldn't have to audition for our trust when it comes to what's the right thing. Like, prove to me that you're an innocent person when you got 9 minutes of footage right there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, I just for what it's worth, I'll interject this. The purpose of this episode is not to talk about what's going on with the looting and with the riots per se, but I am less inclined to believe that the individuals who are peacefully protesting the murder of George Floyd are the same people that are going in and throwing boulders through Target's front windows.
I just brought it up because I know somebody will. And
absolutely,
that's that brought up. So just need to kind of go ahead and get that off the table.
Well, I'm glad that you did that, and I'm just adding my support to that. I don't think there's any reason to conclude that these are the same people, and unfortunately, I'm inclined to believe that these are anarchists that are coming in and trying to take advantage of a time of social unrest, as bad as the murder of George Floyd is, and then to exploit that for their own agendas, which is even more unfortunate and even more speaks to the issue that is at play, that we're talking about today, because now this is being buried either because of just the vast amount of damage that's being done to local businesses, not to mention human lives that are being taken or at least folks being, damaged. I'm trying to say beaten or hurt as a result of what's going on. It's just burying what the true issue is, number one. And then number two, some people are feeling more emboldened maybe in their racist beliefs because they are connecting the peaceful protesters with the looters that are, going through the streets of some of our major cities all throughout the country. It's just terrible.
Can I add a little bit to that?
Please.
We have to be able to see the distinction between the people who are rioting and people who are protesting, because there is a distinction between them. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that there's some overlap. Some of them are the same people. Let's when we look at the occurrence, I think that one of the questions has to be why. Why are there people who are in the streets protesting? Maybe a person feels so frustrated and doesn't have the moral compass to say rioting isn't right, and so they resort to that, or they resort to burning things. Mm-hmm. It is not right in any way, shape, or form. But the question must be, what is it that they are so angry about? Maybe a person lacks the articulation to convey their point. Maybe they feel that there are no ears that are willing to listen to them. So again, the question is, well, why? Why are there thousands of people out in the streets protesting quietly? Or why are there people who may be frustrated to the degree that they are looting? What's really causing this? What has caused this unrest? And it doesn't in any way justify sinful behavior or wicked behavior or illegal behavior. But why is that happening? And so what it does is, you mentioned, Robert, it buries the major issue, and it gives license to people who don't want to talk about it in the very first place to say, oh, well, you see there, here's rioting, you see there, here's, and so now we don't want to talk about the issue. And so if you bring it up, it's, well, no, let's talk about the looting first. No, let's talk about the rioting first. And while those are worthy conversations to have, the why has to be addressed also, even if there are those negative outbursts from people, whatever they may be. The real question is, what can we do about this injustice that's taking place? There is race that's interwoven in it, but it's people who feel that police can run roughshod over them, and there's nothing that's done. Whether it's, if I write, nothing is done. If I peacefully protest, nothing is done. If I kneel or stand, nothing is done. If I make a speech, nothing is done. So maybe my level of frustration, to the degree that I'm going to have an outburst because I don't have godliness to balance me, I'm going to do something to get somebody's attention. Doesn't make it right, but at least it might give a little insight as to why people may feel they want to go to that degree to get some attention to their cause.
Well, and it reminds me of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and this may not be the best passage to appeal to, but off the top of my head, this is the one that comes to mind. We don't judge the world as though they're members of the church. And Paul wasn't in any way, saying that the behavior of the world was acceptable, but merely saying they have a different standard of morality. And so we're not going to disfellowship the world. That was the context, right? 1 Corinthians 5, because of their sinful behavior. The world will act like the world because that's what they do. Everybody's grappling. I mean, if we're grappling with this as Christians, everybody's grappling with what is the appropriate way to respond to a situation like this. I mean, it's just so it's not baffling in terms of how clearly wrong it is, but it's just, what do we do to heal this problem that, as you guys have already mentioned, it's going to be a perennial problem that plagues humanity because of the presence of sin among us. Zach, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, and I don't want to go back over things that we've talked about, but what you just said about 1 Corinthians 5 brings this up, is that I think as far as American citizens go, we think that it's taken care of because it was taken care of legally. Yeah. And so because segregation is no longer the end thing, and everyone's supposed to be equal and treated equal, and all these laws are on the books, we think that it's taken care of. But the reason that we still have this issue is because the church has not addressed it. It's a sin issue, and the church should be on the fighting end of addressing it, not government.
Mm-hmm. That's a huge point, and so let's go there, and let's begin by saying this. All right, we are all for men who serve the church and love the church, and do not wish to speak disrespectfully of the church. However, to speak as the Bible speaks and to call out some areas where we need to improve, that's to put it lightly, okay, is certainly important. Not just important, but a necessity if we will call ourselves preachers of the gospel of Christ. And so, we need to talk about this for just a minute. Let me treat, Zach, what you just brought up in two sections. Number one, you mentioned that many of us believe that because segregation isn't a thing anymore, because legally there are laws in place that prevent some of this activity, that maybe therefore we've sort of put that on the shelf as a thing of the past. We write about it and read about it in history books, and that's that. We sort of relegate it there and leave it there. Can I ask you guys, and Zach, maybe let's start with you. I mean, what was it like growing up as an African-American man in the United States in recent history? I mean, none of us are old in this conversation here. Can you maybe peel back the curtain a little bit and tell us how, even though those laws have always been in place, right, during the time that you've been alive, this is still a pressing issue for you in your life?
Sure. I may be more of a unique situation. For half of my, from about age 14, my high school years, let's say, was spent at a predominantly white congregation. And if there were any issues, they were not made known to me. All of my life, parents, grandparents, we always went to different predominantly black, predominantly white congregations for VBSs, lectureships, gospel meetings. So my childhood wasn't like other stories that I've heard, as far as having to confront that at an early age. Now, later, yeah, I've had to confront some issues, especially as you begin driving and going places on your own in stores that someone may not think that you need to be in there because you are black, or they don't think you have the means to buy what's in the store. But as far as childhood goes, I had a relatively great childhood and was not confronted by these issues until later on.
Zach, you grew up in a part of Tennessee where the Lord's Church is very, very much represented, right? I mean,
So in Warren County, where I grew up, there's about 40 there are about 40 congregations of the Lord's Church.
Okay.
39, 40.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Okay, great. But as you said, there may be subtle things that white people
Yeah.
maybe don't have to consider. I mean, nobody
Right.
looks at me and says, or even thinks, I don't get the impression that they're thinking, can you really afford all of this that you're trying to pay for?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
why are you in this store? Are you going to harm me in some way? I mean, that's a reality that I would hardly even believe exists were it not for people like you guys that I'm now beginning to listen to, Stephen, do you mind sharing maybe some of this, or to what extent have you been affected in these ways? Do you have some similar experiences?
I've had some experiences that were unfavorable.
Mm-hmm.
They do not compare in any way to the things that my parents experienced being born in 1952 for my mother and 1945 for my father. They experienced things that I can scarcely even imagine. And so my experiences were a lot different from theirs. Now, I did grow up hearing, you have to be careful when you go here. You have to be careful where you go there. You have to speak a certain way. Make sure that you don't touch things, make sure that people see that you're not doing this or doing that. And so I was always reared with this idea of you have to be extra careful, not even to look suspicious. Now, whether or not it was a reality that people would look at me that way, the context in which my parents grew up caused them to give me that sort of thinking. Now, as I grew up later, my teenage years, by the time I reached teens, I had gone to a school that was predominantly black, went to a school that was predominantly white, and I had experiences there, none of which were terrible, but things that kind of make you, look back now and kind of think about. I wonder what was the catalyst for a person's behavior in a certain occasion, things like that. But as I got older, I did experience some things that were, that I believe had some racial motivation. I have been stopped by police. I've never been beaten on by police or anything like that for no reason. But I've been stopped and questioned. And even though a person may not overtly say, hey, I'm doing this because you're black, you don't belong here. You are made to feel that way. I've been in a car dealership and I intentionally sometimes will go in just a t-shirt and shorts. And I'll have people, right off the bat, you want to show me the cheapest, it talked to me about, my interest rates and my credit scores. I'm like, I can afford whatever it is I want to afford, and you don't always know the motivation, but there have been some things that make me think, at least by a person's behavior, that maybe there is some racial motivation. Now my age, I'm 41. The way I carry myself, the way I dress, the way I speak, kind of helps to keep some of that back. But now I have a 19-year-old nephew living with me who looks, dressed, and acts like a normal 19-year-old. From the second he moved in with me, we have had about 3 interactions with authority that have been extremely unfavorable. Now, are they all coincidence? Maybe. But are there things that have maybe been racially motivated? It's possible. Because none of that, I've been in Arkansas for 7 years, never had one unfavorable experience. None. He's been in for 6 weeks. We've had 3. So it makes me think maybe there is something to this all. And I don't know those individuals' histories and that, so I couldn't necessarily say those people are racist. But it sure makes you think like maybe there's something else going on. So those are just some of my experiences.
Yeah. Stephen, I know you have family in Michigan. Is that where you grew up, or where did you grow up?
I was born and reared in Detroit, Michigan. Okay. I left Detroit to go to Memphis to preaching school in 2011. So I was from 79 to 11, I was in Detroit.
Yeah. And you mentioned about your parents. Did they grow up in the South, or what part? Were they from Michigan as well? Or do you mind sharing that information?
Yes. Both my parents lived in Michigan. My mom was born in Memphis, but she left a couple of years after that. So they were both born or reared in Detroit. My father is a Vietnam veteran, so he spent he spent a lot of time overseas, but he spent a lot of time in other states during his military time. And he's shared some experiences with me prior to even deploying to Vietnam, some things in Texas in the 60s that were horrible. And I'm thinking, wow. And, there are sometimes people will say, oh, man, slavery was, this many years ago. And I said, no, man, my dad, he's still alive. My dad was told, you can't drink coffee here. You can't be served in this restaurant, called names I wouldn't repeat on here.
Yeah.
You know, for no other reason other than, you know, his skin color was darker than the individuals who were using those words toward him.
Oh, boy. Boy, that just breaks my heart to hear that. Eric Mason, in his book Woke Church, An Urgent Call for Christians in America to Confront Racism and Injustice, mentions that he has to hold back tears when he delivers what he refers to as, quote, the talk. He says, the talk that every black parent has with their children. The talk is our way of preparing our children for what it means to live in America today, end quote. It sounds like that's the experience, Zach, that you and Stephen have referred to so far. I mean, that this is a part you have to think about the way that you're dressing, the way that you're thinking, the way that you're looking. I mean, the way that you're coming across as somebody else in a way of trying to prevent something coming up that really is without foundation to begin with. Yeah.
It's kind of a crazy phenomenon, Brother Robert, and I don't know that anybody could relate to it unless you actually been in the shoes. Normally when we get dressed to go somewhere or something, you know, we just, what matches with what, or what's the temperature going to be?
Yeah.
But it's a reality that there are times that you have to really consider, how am I going to be perceived by the people that I'm around? Is this going to make them feel threatened so that it puts them on edge and causes them to confront me? And that's something that, you know, I think about less at my age, but I still do think about, and I talk to my nephew about, my little girls about, who are 7 and 11, and I have to have the talk with them.
Wow. Hiram, tell us about, if you don't mind to do so, do you share in some of these experiences, and in your background, have you had some of that, or, you know, parents relating to that or anything of that nature?
Yeah, before you read that quote, I was going to say, I don't know of any black person anywhere, at least that I grew up with, that hasn't had that talk, whose parents haven't sat them down and told them, you know, now at this time you got to be in, and you can't wear this, and make sure you speak properly, and make sure you do this. And I read one man one time, he said, it's called being twice as good. You know, you don't want to just do the right thing, but you've got to be above reproach times 2, just because sometimes people assume the worst. I've grown up in Hollywood, Florida. I didn't grow up in the church. I wasn't beat or chased around. I've been stopped by the police, and I've had some encounters that were less favorable than others. I haven't necessarily had any overt racism or that sort of thing, but Stephen, it's ironic you mentioned being from Detroit. My mom was raised in Detroit, and she's told me stories of things that happened to her. She was born in '67, and things that have happened to family members of mine and things like that. And so, I don't know. I think a lot of black people don't even think twice about it. It's just it's just seen as a part of how you come up and how you live. It's not even something you think about necessarily. And I think there's another aspect to this where prejudice and racism is so much a part of American history that sometimes people will look at their experience and say, well, it's not worthy of mention because I'm not George Floyd. You know, it didn't end up that bad. So I should take my losses and at least say I've never been affected necessarily. And we will downplay things that have happened, being followed around in stores, cops following you around in neighborhoods and all of that stuff, just because, well, at the least you weren't physically assaulted or something like that. But my parents had to talk with me growing up, or going in stores and various things of that nature. But I have been treated well. I can't say that. I mean, I've had good coaches that were white, and as far as the church has been concerned, I've been treated well since I've become a Christian and all of that. But I've had people surprised that, oh, you're the preacher here? I preach at a predominantly white congregation. And that surprised some people. Now, maybe they're surprised at my age. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But sometimes that happens. And so that's even in the church. People are surprised that that's the case. Are you the associate preacher? Are you the pulpit preacher? Like, you know, there's a big shift in people's mindsets with that. And I'm sure that other people can testify to the very same thing.
Yeah, I don't know if you all have had this experience, but you can see, I don't know if I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah.
If you go and you visit somewhere, and maybe it's because I'm single and I don't have anyone with me, but if I go somewhere and I'm the guest speaker and they don't know what I look like, they'll just assume I'm a visitor. and will treat me one way until they figure out I'm the actual guest speaker. I'm the preacher. And then you just see a total change. It's not some random black guy just showing up at this all-white congregation, which shouldn't even be the case to begin with. It should be, oh, we have a visitor who may need to hear the gospel.
Yeah.
No, it's no longer just a random black guy that may harm us or whatever it may be, but he's actually the preacher that's coming that we've asked to speak here. So attitudes do change a whole lot.
For sure.
When they find out that you're actually the preacher that's coming to speak.
Yeah. Well,
that happens a lot. That happens a lot. I like Hiram said, I preach for a congregation where there are, excluding my family, there are probably about 3 other African-American people here. So that makes a total of like 6, 7, 8, something like that. And of a congregation of nearly 200. And so people will say, you preach where now? Or, as Zach said, you go to preach somewhere and where they've never met you, and people kind of look at you, and then once they figure out, oh, hey, brother, I do understand that sometimes people are a little bit more reclusive or skeptical when they don't know you, and maybe it's just the fact that they just kind of want to see who you are and what's going on because they hadn't seen your face before. But it is a strange phenomenon that happens sometimes, and like Hiram said, I've been treated very well. The congregation where I preach has been just amazing, very supportive. We got a lot of love and support and encouragement when we were in Memphis. And I have people who are as close to me as my biological family, in some cases even closer, who do not share the same skin color that I have. And I love them dearly, and they love me and respect me. And so in identifying that there are individuals who do not represent Christ well or do not represent humanity well, we shouldn't sweep every color, white, black, brown, or somewhere in between, with any broad strokes, good, bad, or indifferent.
That's a good point. I mentioned a minute ago that Zach brought up some things, and so we talked about in the first place that there are laws that are in place. But the fact that those laws exist do not curtail, what exists within the hearts of men and what they might do even in spite of those laws, or what they might do under, flying under the radar of the law. And then to the other degree now, let's switch gears and talk about this specifically from a religious standpoint. And you guys have hinted at this already. And let's talk about the church and how the church factors into this. What I want us to do is to talk about the issue of racism for just a minute as an issue. Do we even need to be talking about this as Christians? I mean, is the gospel relevant as we're getting into some of this? Zach, let's start with you on this. Is racism something that Christians need to talk about? Is something that we preachers need to preach about? And are we justified in doing so?
The Bible deals with it. Although the Bible deals with it in terms of ethnicity and not necessarily skin color, it's there. Especially in Galatians 1 and 2. And I know a lot of people that don't want to deal with race will say, well, no, Paul and Peter got into it over ethnicity. Well, it's the same thing. Peter was favoring the Jews over Gentiles when he had already been given the clearance to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And so we see his preference whenever other groups were around. So ethnicity is a race issue. Skin color is a race issue. And so if the Bible deals with it, then we as well need to deal with it, and need to deal with it often. It needs to be in our cycle of preaching because it is still an issue. And one thing that Stephen and Hiram brought up is I think we have a caricature of what a racist looks like. And not only does Hiram and Stephen bring this up, but even before Dr. King was assassinated, he would say how the North could show the South how to hate. And so it's not just a backwoods Southern issue. It's an issue wherever the Lord's church is, which means we should be everywhere. Because sin is everywhere, and it is something that we need to tackle.
Yeah. As I think about it, I mean, you think about, maybe this isn't a complete parallel. Think about the way that the disciples react when Jesus is speaking with the Samaritan woman at the well. Think about the way the Samaritan woman reacts when Jesus is speaking with her. You really can't understand the underminings and the culture of Jesus's day unless you sort of get a grip on the elitism that the Jews felt over the Gentiles generally. And then, you get into the specific sects that Jesus would have dealt with and how there was even elitism among the Jews themselves. You get into the book of Acts and, boy, Peter has to be almost drug kicking and screaming to Cornelius's house. He doesn't get the vision at first, rise, Peter, kill and eat. Not so, Lord. You argue with God about a vision that you're seeing and what God is commanding you to do, and he almost uses his own heritage and even his Jewish accomplishments. I've never done anything like this. Why would I start now? Well, maybe because the Lord's commanding you to do it, It's just interesting. And we go ahead, Hiram. Yeah.
I was going to say, and then tagging on with that, along with what you asked Zach, after the conversion of Cornelius in Acts 10, Peter has to defend it in Acts 11 to the Jews.
That's
Much like today, when you preach on this issue, you have to defend it to some people that it's even worthy to be talked about. And so in Acts 11, Peter had, they heard the sermon in Acts 2, as many as the Lord our God shall call. Many of them heard the Great Commission from Jesus. Surely they should have already known that the gospel was for all people. But even after all of that, Peter still has to make a defense. And then you get to Acts 15 and the church is still having this problem. But I just want to say that briefly, that even in the first century, there was a need to not only address it, but defend the fact that it's even being addressed, because maybe you look like the divisive one when you bring it up. And there is a way to bring this thing up and be divisive, but just because somebody says we need to have this conversation doesn't mean they're saying every white Christian in America is a bad person. They're just saying, hey, just like we talk about any other sin, right? You might not have people in your congregation who are practicing homosexuals, but we preach on homosexuality. Or you may not have people there that are lining up to have abortions, but yet we preach on those matters and issues, because we know it's more than the practice of a thing. It's our mindsets towards sin, and even to start to cower mentally and to give in and say, well, that's not so bad. I wouldn't do that, but that's not so bad.
Right.
We've got to preach the whole counsel of God. And especially with an issue like this one, people need to hear it, because Stephen, you talk about his parents, my parents. This isn't something that happened. There are people living today that were alive when they couldn't eat and drink at the same water fountains. The gospel can change people, and it does. But we shouldn't be surprised if there's some residual effects in people's minds that need to be addressed, that, hey, there are no second-class citizens in the kingdom of God. And I just want to remind you of that. And we shouldn't have to apologize for doing that.
Well, and I think that for many of us, and maybe those of us who don't have the heightened awareness that you guys have because of everything that's been going on. And I don't mean to say that in a way that's like excluding or even, sanctioning that it's okay for us to not have that awareness. I think we should. But, some of us have very much partaken in white privilege, just not having to fear for the kind of looks we give people or the way that we dress or any of that. And then us same folks are reading through the Bible, and we're not picking up on the racial tensions between Jews and Gentiles. We're not picking up on, Peter's resistance in the book of Acts. And, we read Acts chapter 10 and Acts chapter 11 almost not as a huge momentous occasion. Hey, the gospel is extended to the Gentiles as well as the Jews. Instead, we just say, oh, well, that's good, and then we keep going. And it's almost like, don't think that just because maybe the Bible doesn't necessarily say, hey, I'm talking about racism now, don't think that there aren't principles within there that are very clear that are showing us, hey, listen, this is a gospel issue. It's actually quite something that very much dominated the conversation in the book of Acts, and was a very difficult issue. Zach, you pointed out from Galatians that even the apostles grappled with. Not to mention the other folks. Paul has to address it, how Jesus tore down the wall that divided us in Ephesians chapter 2, and on and on. It just keeps on coming up over and over again. This was something that they grappled with. And Hiram, I wonder sometimes if maybe the reason why some of us are a little resistant toward, you said, hey, we preach on these things and nobody, feels compelled to speak out against that. Why are you going to speak? I wonder if sometimes we have a guilty conscience, either because maybe we've adhered to some of these mental principles before, whether we've actually come out and said something racist or even just thought it. Or maybe we feel guilty because we don't know as much about that aspect of American history, and therefore that part of life that you've just told us is very real for you guys and just hasn't been for us. I don't know what it is, and I learned a long time ago, I can't reason why people think the way that they think, but it just makes you wonder whether there's some guilty conscience involved in some of that.
I think no doubt we're ashamed about the country's history as a whole. And I would even say in some sense ashamed at how slow the church was to respond, like the laws beat the church in doing the right thing, right? And so I think there is some shame in that regard, and it just makes people feel uncomfortable. That's the bottom line. But like we say about any other biblical topic, just because it makes a person uncomfortable doesn't mean that we shouldn't address it. And so it's just one of those issues that makes people feel uneasy. And so because of that, we'd rather think, like was mentioned already, this is already solved. It's already covered up. We have mixed congregations, interracial congregations, interracial marriage in some places. And so there's no need to mention it. Just that's causing more of a problem than to bring it up, or just make a blanket statement like the gospel is the answer, which it is. But what does that look like? Sometimes that's even used as a scapegoat. Not that the gospel isn't powerful enough to change it. But what does that mean? It doesn't just mean it deals with repentance. It deals with how we engage with people once we become Christians. But sometimes we just throw that out there to keep from having the hard conversation that we need to have with people, and even to listen on these fronts. I think that's one of the issues. Once a person's in Christ, yes, the gospel is the answer. But when people that I know that are in Christ or even aren't in Christ are telling me about things that they've experienced, who would make this kind of a thing up? Why would you doubt somebody anyway? What's fun about this? And so I think the gospel is the answer, because the gospel helps me, to Romans 12:15, weep with those that weep, to sympathize with them, even if I haven't been in their shoes, to assume the best. 1 Corinthians 13 says love doesn't think evil or assume the worst of anybody. If somebody's saying this has been their reality, while it might not be monolithic and true for everybody, I do need to listen and say, man, I'm sorry, and that's unfortunate that happened, because the gospel is the answer. The gospel makes a difference, not only in dunking a man in water for the forgiveness of sins, but also changing how we relate to people and how we try to sympathize with the hardships other people have faced, even though we haven't. And I think that's another thing about this, that you don't have to be black necessarily to listen or to try to understand what's going on. Like I said, other sins. Never been raped, but we try to understand where people are coming from in those circumstances that have experienced heartache or human trafficking or whatever the sin may be, physical abuse in the marriage. You don't have to be a victim of those things to sympathize with people or empathize with people that have been in those same shoes, because the Bible commands us to do that, to put ourselves in the place of other people, because that's at the heart of the gospel. Jesus did that for us, and we need to try as best as we can to do that. You don't have to hate yourself or anything, but you do need to try to listen.
Hey, I mean, there are Christians that are still grappling with whether interracial marriage is a sin, or and things like. I mean, there are still in modern America today, and they struggle with finding the answer to that question biblically. And I don't mean to disparage asking an honest question so much as just it exposes a fundamental misunderstanding about what the gospel is, the equality of human beings, that harkens all the way back to this history in our culture, specifically as we're talking about it today. So it's very much a relevant issue to this point that we need to talk about.
If I could just throw this in.
Please.
One of the, if you look at current historical context of the churches of Christ here in America, we have become apathetic, and we have become so comfortable in our condition that we aren't even willing to have conversations or do things that are outside the comfort zone. We have very little desire to address situations that bring discomfort. Even when look at some of the major things that make us uncomfortable. Church discipline. It's hard to talk about that, so it's not addressed. Giving sometimes. It's taboo to talk about what a person gives and whether or not they should give. So we don't like to talk about it. People say, preacher, don't talk about giving too much. Why? It's in the Bible. Why shouldn't I talk about it? Things about race. Well, we shouldn't talk about it. I've been told, at least with this, with racial issues, well, that's a social thing. Well, the Bible addresses social things because it affects Christians. And so Christians should have a voice or social things. When individuals are mistreated, it has to be addressed. Earlier today, I was thinking about Acts 6 with the Grecian widows. It was no discussion of, well, what about the Hebrew widows? And, well, those widows are always complaining anyway. Well, if those widows were in need, then it had to be addressed. And we have to just look at what's going on, whether it's a social issue that affects Christians or not. We should be able to display what the Bible actually teaches about that, how we should view it with compassion, understanding, and as Hiram alluded, I don't necessarily have to understand or agree with what another person says, but I have to respect and at least validate it. Kind of strangely, one of the things that helped me to see that was a movie, Gone with the Wind. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's like a forever long movie. And my wife and I watched it one day, and what it did for me is allowed me to see what those individuals saw of the soldiers coming down that were burning Atlanta. While their cultural context was wrong, despicable, having the slaves in that, there were still individuals who were afraid. There were still people who were thinking, oh, our homes are going to be burned, we're going to be killed, what's going to happen to us? And there were people who were still afraid. Now, did that mean it justified everything they were doing? No. But it still was a perspective that was worthy of recognition, whether or not I agree with it or I can understand what it felt like to be in their shoes. And so what that point out to me is, Stephen, if I want people to hear me and respect me and my opinions and my experiences, then I too have to be open to respect and hear theirs, whether or not I think it makes sense or whether or not it's just that one. I can't say, well, you're the only person that feels that way. So what? Those are still feelings that person has that are worthy of recognition, whether they just have a gentle faith or whether they are sensitive people or whatever the case, it's still worthy of recognition. The Lord, there's about 9 or 10 times he addresses people and it says he had compassion on them. Didn't matter if they knew they traveled way out and didn't have food. And, you should have been thinking about whether or not you have food. The Lord didn't say, well, why didn't you bring the lunch? He was compassionate on those people. There's a man that's blind. He didn't say, well, why are you blind? You were out there playing with fireworks and poked your own eye out or something. No, here's a person who has a need. I'm going to be compassionate. And that's a great lesson. I think we, whether we're black or white, young or old, whatever the issue, to say there's a person who has an issue or a need. I'm going to try to suffer with you, be compassionate with you, and just hear you out and see if there is a solution to be found in this situation.
Great points. Zach, what do you want to add to this discussion?
I don't have anything to add to all of that.
What? You're the guy that preaches over an hour and you don't have anything to say?
Nothing left in the tank.
All right. Well, okay. I'm in disbelief over here. All right, great. No, I'm adding levity to a conversation that it has felt very heavy for me, and I'm thankful that you guys have mentioned the things that you have, and completely agree. And listen, hey, if you're listening to this and you realize that over the last several minutes you sort of heard but didn't hear, back up the episode and re-listen to some of those. There was some practical stuff just there that we need to be hearing about compassion, and even hearing what other people are saying. We're so dismissive in our culture that leads to some of the division in our culture that says, oh, that's crazy, what they're feeling is stupid or whatever. And, that's something that we need to think about.
Hey, Robert, I was going to say this, but since you brought that up, I do want to say, Stephen mentioned people talk about the social gospel, and that's a social issue. And you're right, we are so dismissive. And sometimes we just need to make sure that we are being gospel guided and not being pulled in different directions, whether it be political or otherwise. And that's for both sides or whatever side you're on, because sometimes people will take an issue like this and say, well, they can't sympathize or they couldn't possibly agree that it's wrong because obviously this is something the left is doing or this is something the right is doing, instead of being Christians who acknowledge the good on whoever's saying it and acknowledge and call out the wrong on whatever side, and not being dismissive because, well, a Democrat got up and said this, or that couldn't be right because a white Republican said this or that. And if we're going to be gospel-centered people, when we see wrongdoing, politics doesn't come into the equation for Christians. It's what does the gospel of Jesus Christ teach me to do, and how should I respond based on that? And I think sometimes our allegiances are so intertwined, and we're trying to defend so many different causes and uphold so many banners at one time, that when we see a George Floyd, it's like, we've got to make sure, that's why it takes so long. I've got to process all of this and make sure. Not if you're a Christian. And I don't mean you can't be discerning. Christianity is built on logic and reason and discerning for sure. But once you see what's going on, you need to be able to call that out. And whoever that puts you at odds with, whatever agenda that cracks, so be it. Mm-hmm. And that's what made Jesus different. Jesus would rebuke the Pharisees, but when they were right, he would say they were right. He'd deal with the Samaritan woman and surprise his disciples, but also call her out for her worship practices that were wrong. And so it's possible to do that. And Jesus calls us to do that. That's part of becoming all things to all men and just being people of light.
I love that point. Yeah. And so many folks, and I'm thinking I want to do an episode in the future about what is social gospel, and how can we be sure that we're responding in the way that we should. But I think, just to speak to the point that you just raised, Hiram, there are so many folks that because they want to avoid some things, they just avoid the whole thing, and they just don't deal with it. And you know what? We have done that in our history. There are even some instances where we have chosen to avoid Bible words because they are on the whole misunderstood in the religious culture of our day. And just these things ought not so to be. If we really believe the Bible like we say we do, then we ought to walk the walk, as so many of Paul's epistles tell us to do, right? You got the theological section, and then you got the practical section. If you believe this, then here's what you do. And maybe that's something for us to think about too. Zach, I want to start with you on this final question as we make our rounds today. And let's start with this one. All right, there are white Christians that are listening or watching this, and they're saying, I sort of feel stalled. Sometimes we might feel a little pressure because we feel like our silence in the past has spoken more than we intended it to. Maybe our silence right now is speaking more than we really intended to. We don't want to say the wrong thing, so we don't say anything at all, whatever, right? I'm just expressing maybe what some folks may be thinking or feeling, right or wrong, justified or not. What should white Christians be doing right now if we're interested in being gospel-centered and maybe trying to work toward I don't know if solution is the right word, but at least a brighter future?
Yeah, I think for the time that we are in, with emotions being as high as they are, really what we need for our white brothers and sisters to do is to listen. As we work through these emotions, yes, we've been working through these our whole lives, but incidents like George Floyd just brings them back up. And so I have no doubt, especially with the two guys that are on here with me and others that I've seen and talked to, we will be respectful, but we just need to get some things off our chest, and we need you to listen. I think Hiram is the one that brought up Romans, where we are to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. We just need you to listen to us right now. And then once that stage is over, we need you to dialogue with us. It's one thing to listen, but then in order for things to change, we need to dialogue with each other and not be afraid to dialogue. And perhaps the reason that we haven't dialogued in the past is, I think you said it, Robert, that there may be some shame there. And you know what? I don't know of any sin that doesn't come with shame. Every sin comes with shame. And so that again pushes home the point that racism is a sin because there is shame with it. But as we've said throughout this entire podcast, that doesn't stop us from talking about other sins that may bring up shame in our lives. So listen, and then let's have helpful, healthy dialogue.
Wow. All right. Sounds good. The listening part is a little easier maybe than the healthy, helpful dialogue, although we have to be willing to listen, realizing that what we're going to hear is stuff that may not be really fun to hear, really exciting to hear. and maybe in some cases might invoke some of those feelings of shame, if nothing else, just out of the ignorance that many of us had prior to this. So thanks for that. Stephen, let's just go around the horn with this. Is there anything, you just offered us a lot of great practical things. When we talk about some things that white Christians ought to be doing right now, is there anything specifically you want to say to white brothers and sisters in Christ?
First, let me say it. I would hope that all of us see the terminology, and I know you're just using it accommodatively.
Yes.
But we should reverse the terminology, not white Christian, but Christians that are white.
There you go.
Christians that are black, because that should be the very primary focus. And I'm not saying you're doing it for any reason other than just accommodation for this.
No, I'm glad you said that. I think that's a great point.
But I would think that what Zach said should be at the top. Listen, and not only listen, but hear. Jesus was used that terminology and kind of distinction over in the book of Revelation. If you have ears, hear. Make sure you listen and be willing to make adjustments if it's necessary. Demonstrate true Christianity, which would mean having compassion and love. But another thing is that I think a passage like Galatians chapter 3 can throw people off a little bit. When we look at verse 28, there's neither Jew or Greek, bond or free, male or female. I've heard people say, and one recently said, I think his intentions were good. I don't see color. And then he went on. And I say that can almost be dismissive. We do have different colors. We do have different experience. Now, what that passage is teaching is not that the things don't exist. There were still Jews and Gentiles. There were still bond and free. You see that with Philemon and Onesimus. You see male and female. There's distinctions in teaching how the role of the male, the husband, and the female, the wife, and that. So you know that those distinctions were still there. But what is Paul really writing about? We don't treat one another differently on the basis of those. There's no higher or lower on either one of those. And so if a person sees me as a Christian, yes, but see that I am black and see that I am a male or whatever the occasion. I am rich or poor or, big or small or tall, whatever it is, those things affect the way I live. And so please don't ignore them. Don't treat me poorly because of them, but at least recognize that they are there. And so when addressing people, do see the difference in the fact that we aren't all the same and there is no static condition between individuals. And when we listen without defending. If there is something that I feel, don't feel that you have to make a defense for yourself or others. Sometimes it comes across dismissive. Sometimes it may be a defense mechanism because you may feel guilty or what have you. But just listen without defending. And love without condition. Don't say, well, if you would do this, then it'd be easier. Just love without condition. And not to say you love when people are sinning, no. But love the individual because that's what we're supposed to do. Jesus didn't say, come down, I want you all to love just the folks that act like you. We're to love our neighbors. We're to love our brothers. We're to love our enemies. So that covers just about anybody you can think of. And so those are the couple of things I think I would say that our brethren can do. And not just brethren that are white, brethren that are black can listen also to our counterparts. And while we're on it, let me just say this. I don't like the idea that because a brother or sister or person is white, that they don't have anything to say. I think that that's not healthy to say, since you're white and you're not me, which is true, you're not me, then you have nothing to say on the issue. Well, absolutely. I want to be able to hear maybe why a person may feel the way they feel or so it allows us to have more dialogue. So I think an open door of conversation needs to be there and everybody needs to listen and exercise biblical principles, being patient, long-suffering, and being willing to make a correction. We're the four of us that are on this, we're having this conversation, but it doesn't mean that we are authorities or that we're always right on the things that we do. God is always right. That's period. So if we can find ourselves in line with the word, then we'll be all right.
Wow. Yes, sir. Love that. Hiram, you got anything that you want to tack on?
They took all the good stuff, man. I'll say that listening is important for both sides, for sure. But if, I know a lot of white Christians right now are wondering what they can do or what they should say. I know a lot of people are afraid that if they say something, it may be interpreted as racist because, as Stephen mentioned, sometimes, Black people go to extremes just like anybody else, and you can't say anything but I would say listening helps. And I would also say that, not necessarily thinking that you have to respond the way other people have responded. And by that, I mean, just because everybody makes a social media post doesn't mean that you're being silent or inactive because you didn't post or share a hashtag, which again, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying there is no one way to necessarily respond. So listen. And another thing is, we say the gospel's the answer, and it is. I would say if I'm a white Christian and or Black or whatever, to remember the basic fundamentals of the gospel. I think sometimes we treat racism like it's the super sin that can't be subdued because of our nation's history. And yes, it will always be among us, but just the basic things that we may have taught in, kids' Bible classes or heard all of our lives, the fruit of the Spirit, Romans 12, treating people properly, like those basic things. I'm talking about to the guy that's walking down the street with his shirt off when you and your wife were out for a jog, that may be Black, and you may be wondering like, oh, what's going on? Just giving the benefit of the doubt, or going to the store and not clutching your purse because you see somebody and you think they're going to do just the basic decency, being a Christian, expecting the best of people. That's where the change is really going to be seen, because as we've already talked about, the laws can't make people be how they should be. Jesus is going to do that, but that's going to happen one person at a time, one neighbor at a time, one school at a time. So I know we swing for the fence and we want to go march and all that's good. I'm just saying you can make a difference, and it might be a lot quieter than you think. Just real briefly, I'll say this. Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman in John 4. And then she goes and tells her whole town. And then they say later on in John 4, now we believe, not because of what you said, but we've heard them ourselves. And then we get to Acts 8, the soil is already ripe and ready for Philip to do work and convert a host of Samaritans. But it started with one conversation with one woman. And so we should look at our lives and see what one conversation can I have that can make a difference, and do the basics.
Yeah. So as we're starting this and where we go from here, it seems like practicing the golden rule, which is called the golden rule for a reason. It works, and you can apply it in almost in any circumstance. I shouldn't qualify it. In any circumstance, you can apply the golden rule. As we think about just our interpersonal relationships and building trust one person at a time, and building that trust then will provide the environment that we need to have the dialogue that we ought to have. Loving unconditionally, as just been mentioned, being willing to listen, and then being willing to speak, and to speak with kindness, and to speak and then to hear what's being said, even if it hurts in some instances, or even if it makes us a little uncomfortable. We've got to be willing to do those things. But, we're well equipped to do that as the Lord's disciples. We have what we need to do that. And, whether or not we can convince the entire country, or much less the entire world, what we can do is be known as people who stood for something different, who said what we're experiencing now is unacceptable, and who said we're going to do whatever we can, not just to cry out about it, although that's important. I'm speaking now from a Christian who is white, but then to say, all right, but what can we do to help with this problem? What can we do and not to jump to the fix it stage too quickly. We need to listen first. So often we don't want to listen. We just want to jump to fix it. And that's not really going to help us a whole lot either. This is a complex issue. There's a lot to think about. In the last an hour plus, we have talked about a lot of those things, and we have been greatly helped, yes, by these three guys. Let me mention something that you said, Stephen, just one last time, and I'm so glad that you brought it up. I think sometimes we are tempted to be a certain ethnicity first and then a Christian. And so I'm going to honor my heritage above my Christianity. Or I'm going to say, well, this is who I am in my culture, and then I'm a Christian. And that's completely out of order. And it's something that we need to think about no matter, what aspect we're coming from. And I'm glad that you brought that up. And you're right, I was using it accommodatively. So thanks for giving me the benefit of the doubt there. Appreciate that very much. Stephen Ford in Arkansas, that's Hiram Kemp you're seeing on the screen right now. But when Stephen speaks, then you will see him. Stephen, thanks for being a part of our conversation today. It means a lot.
Absolutely, man. Thank you for having me. I've appreciated being able to talk with you guys, have love and respect for you. And I pray that much good can come from our discussion and from other individuals who are making like efforts.
Yeah. Thank you very much, brother. And Hiram Kemp, let's cut back over to you now. If you'll say a word or something so that the people that can see you at home.
Well, appreciate you having me on, Robert, and I'm glad to be a part of it. Appreciate you doing it, and Zach and Stephen, appreciate y'all's work. And we know that Jesus is going to conquer in the end. He rules in the kingdoms of men, and his people will make a difference as we put to practice the things he teaches us to do. So
that's right. Yeah. Appreciate you being on, brother, and thank you for your insights today. And Zack Martin in Louisville, Kentucky. We appreciate your insights as well today, sir, and thanks for everything. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me on. Everything that you do is always great and beneficial to the kingdom, so I appreciate that. And anytime I can be with my buddy Hiram, and it's good to meet Stephen and get to know him.
Yeah.
So appreciate it.
Good stuff. Well, we appreciate you being with us for this. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you have questions, comments, something that you'd like us to address further, we certainly would like to do that. Send me an email, robert@thelightnetwork.tv. You can find more information about the podcast that we do, Christian podcast designed to encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith, on our website at thelightnetwork.tv. And subscribe to this show, TLN Specials, or to any of our podcasts in any podcast app that you can find. Just search for The Light Network or a specific show, and you'll find what you need there. Thanks for joining us today as we've talked about America, racism, and the gospel. And until next time, I'm Robert Hatfield. Appreciate you being with us.